Thank you for tuning into my channel. Today we want to address figuring out how much sashing fabric you need to complete your quilt. So if you want to know how to go from your drawing to your actual quilt and be sure you got the right amount of fabric, please stay tuned. There are some basic facts that you need to know about fabric before you start your project. I usually start with a drawing like this one. But even before you get to the drawing, there's some things that you need to make sure that you understand before we try to figure out how much fabric you need. The first thing that you need to understand is that your fabric is probably going to be 44 inches wide. Now the width of the fabric is determined from selvage to selvage, and I'm going to show you as an example some newspaper. Okay, I'm going to be using newspaper to help with our demonstration to help figure out how much fabric we need. Okay, and the newspaper naturally has a fold in it, so that's going to help because when it's time to cut your fabric, you are going to fold it. All right, so this will be, for our example, the right side of our fabric. And so this top part will be one selvage, and then the bottom part will be another selvage. Okay, so from selvage to selvage, your fabric is probably going to be 44 inches wide. Most quilting fabric is 44 inches wide. In some cases, you might have fabric that is 60 inches wide, but the principles for figuring out how much fabric you need are going to be the same. You just need to take into account the width of your fabric. Okay, so our selvages are typically from selvage to selvage 44 inches wide. The other thing that you need to remember is that 1 yard is 36 inches. That is going to make more sense when we near the end of figuring it out, because you need to transfer from inches into yards. And when you get to the fabric store, you will probably want to tell the salesperson how many yards of fabric to cut for you. Okay? So, with those things being said, let's go ahead and get started. Typically with your fabric, it's not going to matter how you cut it, because sometimes you might choose to use the same fabric for the sashings going horizontally and vertically. And if you're using the same fabric, then it doesn't matter which way you cut it most of the time. Let me show you some examples of fabric where it doesn't matter which way you cut it, if you cut it long ways first or short wise. Okay, here's an example of some fabric. I use this for backing fabric on one of my quilts, but you can see the pattern is not going to change, and so it won't matter if you cut it long or short. Okay, this other fabric is the money fabric, and it doesn't matter because there was money all over it, so it doesn't matter which way you cut it, because the pattern is all over it and it doesn't matter. Alright, the next one is one that I'm using right now as a backing fabric, and this is basketball fabric. You see that the pattern is all over it, and so it doesn't matter if I wanted to cut it long ways or if I wanted to cut it by the short side. It doesn't matter. Okay? Now, for the quilt that we're going to be talking about today, my son's Georgia Tech jersey quilt, I used this fabric. And so fabric with letters or stripes or very directional patterns, it's going to matter if you cut it long or short. It matters if you cut it this way or if you cut the wider way first. Alright, so today I'm going to show you both ways, and I'm just going to keep this fabric in mind because I did have to cut it different ways. The amount of fabric didn't matter because I was using the same fabric, but I can use this as an example to show you both ways to measure to figure out how much fabric you need. Alright, now first you start with your picture, decide how big you want your sashing. In my case, I made my sashing 12.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Okay, and so the way that you decide whether I was cutting a 12.5 or a 4.5 was the direction of the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to start cutting in just a minute, and I'll show you how to do that. I have our Georgia Tech fabric laid out here beside my newspaper so that you can see and get an idea of how we're going to start cutting. The first way is we're going to cut a short strip. This would be a 4.5 inch strip. Okay, and so I'm going to turn it as an example. So when it's done, it's going to lay this way. And these were the horizontal, let me go down. These were the horizontal strips on the quilt. So in order to cut a short strip, the first thing that you need to remember is that I'm going to show you just an example here. I'm going to use a crayon on the newspaper. Okay, and so I'm just going to draw a line. It doesn't really matter how wide it is necessarily. Okay, but you can see, you'll be able to see that when we cut it, and I'm going to cut it in just a second, when we're done, we have to figure out how many strips we get out of this. Alright, so let's give it a quick cut. Okay, and these are paper scissors I'm using. These are not my sewing scissors, so remember when you're cutting, if you have to cut paper for a second, use your paper cutting scissors before you do that. Alright, so what I'm going to do now, where's my crayon, is I'm going to draw lines, because secondly, you would cut the strips the fabric strips, you're going to cut those into sashing strips. Okay? So just as an example, so you can see that I cut a short strip out of these. Now when you have your fabric and you need to cut, if you're going to cut a shorter strip, then you need to know the distance from the top to the bottom of your fabric, of your strip. Okay, so I'm just going to write long, because this one is cut long ways, I feel like. Okay, and so you need to know the distance from the top to the bottom. Okay, and what these will actually be. Alright, so for this one, you'll need to know the longer length. And so for my quilt, it was 12.5. So the first thing you need to do is figure out how many 12.5 inch blocks you can get from selvage to selvage, from the top to the bottom. Alright, so if you divided 44, that's how wide your fabric is, by the width, or it would be the length of your strip. So you would divide 44 by 12.5 to figure out how many of these you can get out of one strip of this. Okay, and so if you divide that, you'll get 3, and you can see that I got 3. In actuality, it'll be 3 with a little bit of fabric left over. All right, so you have this measurement. You know that you can get 1, 2, 3 of these sashing strips out of one short strip of fabric. Okay, now you need to decide how many of those strips you need, how many sashing strips you need. Okay, and all you would do is go back to your diagram, count how many you need, which would be horizontal, 1, 2, 3, 4 going across, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 going down. So that would be 24 strips or 24 horizontal sashing strips that I needed. Okay, so now what you'll do is, since you get 3 in one strip, you know that you need 8 of these rows to get 24 strips. Okay, now each one of these strips from side to side, it's going to be 4.5 inches wide. Okay, it's 12.5 inches long and 4.5 inches wide. So what you need to do to figure out how many inches of fabric, to figure out the length of fabric, you're going to multiply 4.5, which is this top or this width measurement, and you're going to multiply that by 8, which is the number of total strips you need. Okay, so 4.5 times 8 equals 36 inches. Okay, now remember that we needed to know that 1 yard equals 36 inches. So for our horizontal strips, we would need exactly 1 yard of fabric. I like to go a little bit over that to make sure that in case you make mistakes, you have enough fabric total. Okay, so I might get 1 1/4 just to make sure that I have enough. All right, so that's how you figure out, or that's how I figured out for these horizontal sashing strips. You may choose, instead of doing a shorter strip like the 4.5 inch strip, that you want to do the wider strip, and that's the 12.5. Okay, so what I've done is I'm already marking a mark for a wider strip to cut from, and I'm going to go ahead and cut that. And the only difference is it's going to change the orientation of your sashing just a little bit. Okay. So instead of getting the strips longer, you're going to get kind of fat strips. So instead of doing, okay, now we would cut the short side. You take this wide strip and you would start cutting the short side. Okay, and so it would look more like this. Okay, and I won't take the time to cut those, but well, I'll cut one. But you'll see that even though it's the same strip, the orientation would change just a little bit. But it wouldn't matter if the fabric is an all-over fabric. All right, so when you're going this way, you would look at this 4.5 inch side, okay, and you would do the same steps as before. So you would figure out how many 4.5 inch strips you could get out of one length of fabric, one cut of fabric. All right, so if I divided 44, which is the total width of your fabric, by the large strip that you would be cutting, which would end up being the 4.5. Okay, I would get 9 of these out of that 4.5. Out of that 44 inch strip. Okay, so you take that number, and then you need to figure out how many of these you need. And on this quilt, they're the vertical. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going this way, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 going horizontally. So that would be 25 strips that I would need. All right. So you're going to take that same number. Or well, actually, first you need to figure out how many rows of these you would need to get 25, and you would actually need 9, 18, 27. You would only need 3 rows of these to get all 25 of those, and you'd actually have 2 left over. Okay, so then you would take the number, you would take that, you take the 12.5 and multiply it by 3, because that's the number of rows that you need. So 12.5 times 3 would be